Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories all pertaining to what Donald Trump is going to do once he gets in, whether it be appointments, whether it be what the House is going to go through, whether it be him trying to get the Senate to allow recess appointments, and also maybe some information about what he'll do with colleges. It's all about the future of his presidency at this point. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, what is the biggest cut that Donald Trump will make? Do you think he will make any cuts at all? Do you think he will actually blow out the budget? I've heard lots of speculation that he will blow out the budget, and if his first term was any indication, and the man he tries to emulate so heavily, Ronald Reagan, is an indication, he will probably blow out the spending. So, do you think that that's going to be a consistent trend, or do you think that he's going to turn things around? He's going to cut? I can see him cutting regulations. I don't necessarily see him cutting money from the budget, but hey, I could be wrong. But that is not necessarily exactly what we are talking about today. So let's actually jump into our first article, but I would still love to hear your opinions. Throw them down in the comment section. Now, to the article that comes from the New York Times. Trump's demand to skirt Senate confirmation poses early test of a radical second term. Now, the framing right off the bat, I don't actually agree. They frame him as an authoritarian. They frame it as radical. It has been proposed before, even underneath Obama, to actually use the recess period as a appointment mechanism. And the Senate actually has a rolling member that goes in and bangs the gavel and basically says, even when they're on long recesses, every few days they go in and they say, oh, well, we're technically kind of in session, just to make sure that the president can't actually go in and say, yeah, hey, we're going to appoint these people temporarily for basically a year is the going theory. And the recess has to be about 10 days long for that to be the case. So if you go in every 3 days, you should in theory be fine. They will have no argument. And Obama even took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the Senate's actually able to do that. They're able to just send one person in to bang the gavel, basically call themselves into session in order to prevent the sort of recess appointments. So this is actually a theory that has been run through. Obama tried to do it in the past, so why wasn't he radical when he was trying to do it? Well, you could say that he was radical when he was trying to do it, and if you do that, then I think you're at least consistent. But the New York Times is not calling Obama radical, even when they point out that he tried to do it. So I think it's a little bit of bias when they're coming at it. But does that mean that it's a norm? No, it does not mean that it's a norm. Recess appointments are not something that are normally done. Normally, they are meant for when the Senate is away for a long time and an emergency happens and the president needs to be able to put someone in temporarily. The period seems to be about a year. So if he was to put them in now, it'd be 2025 to 2026, essentially. And there is a legitimate purpose for the recess appointments. And deciding to just do almost all of your appointments as recess appointments, it has multiple problems with it. One, in a year, at the next session of the Senate, they will have to actually readdress it, and they'll have to either confirm or deny those people again. It will go beyond just a recess appointment unless they continue to do the recess appointment thing next time as well. So you basically are just stalling the fact that they would have to be properly appointed by the Senate, and either you're going to have to keep the practice going throughout the entire presidency, or you're going to be bogged down by what he fears to be bogged down at the very beginning with in the middle of his presidency. And that's one of Trump's big fears. That is why he doesn't actually want to have to go through the Senate approval process, because he is afraid that people are going to bog him down. Because even right now, with a 53 to 47 majority in the Senate, all it takes is 3 Republicans saying, hey, I'm not going along with the Trump agenda. Or maybe all it takes is 3 people saying, and more realistically 4, because technically J.D. Vance is the tiebreaker, so he could approve things. But all it takes is a few people peeling away and saying, actually, I kind of like this person, but I don't necessarily think that they have the credentials to be here. They could provide plenty of reasons. If they're in a swing district and they're in a place that actually is a little bit more moderate, they could actually win some bona fides. They could win some credit from the people that put them into office if they stall Trump's agenda, and that's what he's afraid of. But does that mean, just because he's afraid of it, does it mean it's right? No, it is not right. Why does the recess appointment clause exist? We established this at the very beginning. In case there is an emergency, it is not to just get whoever you want through without having to go through the Senate. there are checks and balances on the presidency that are enforced by the Senate and more broadly the legislature and by the judiciary. And if you slowly degrade those norms, it will be used against you. So if we're going to do the whole, hey, we want to protect the norms thing, I'm going to make the argument that one, do you want a Democratic president doing the exact same thing in the future? Because normally, Joe Biden had this in 2020. 2016 was the same case. In 2008 was also a similar case where Obama got his majority. He got the Senate and the House. Donald Trump, he got the Senate and the House. Joe Biden, when he came in, he got the Senate and the House. So normally when there's a sweepstakes, when there's a new change candidate that comes in and takes over, whether they're Democrat or Republican, they normally get a majority or at least a thin enough majority in order to get what they want through in the Senate or the House, which means if you have the exact same thing going forward and it's a thin majority in the Senate, it's like 52 to 48, and the Democratic president says, hey, I don't even want to worry about any of those people peeling off. I don't want a cinema or a mansion, just like happened during Joe Biden's time when he was trying to get Build Back Better through. I don't want them messing up the entire process. I don't want them using their leverage in order to get something from me. Let's talk to the majority leader in the Senate of the new members that have come in on the Democratic side and say, hey, we're going to do recess appointments. One, you don't want that norm to be broken. You don't want to be the one to break that norm, especially when you're Donald Trump and the criticism against you is you're already breaking norms. Two, you don't want that in general because then you're actually overcoming a secondary check. And this is when I say you don't want this, an executive does want this. An executive wants more power to be accumulated in the executive so that they can get more done. So of course they want this. But as a population, we do not want this, even if you are someone who supports Donald Trump, because guess what? The legislature and the presidency, they are elected separately. You do not have one ticket. You say, okay, hey, I'm going to fill in for an R ticket, and that's going to be Donald Trump. And in my case, in Fauquier County, Virginia, it would have been Mike Clancy and Hung Cao. You don't just have a R ticket, quote unquote. You can get recommendations from the Republican Party outside, the Democratic Party outside, but you cannot just fill in one button and fill out the entire ballot for Republican, Democrat. And that is because, guess what? You can have split ticket voting. Maybe someone really likes Donald Trump, but they thought, hey, Mike Clancy was not the person for them. Or maybe they liked Tim Kaine because he's been around a while representing Virginia and he's been doing things that they like for Virginia. So you have these different layers of representation. You have the House district, you have the state as a whole, you have the national representative of the U.S. on the foreign policy side. That is what the president is very good at. That is where he has the most leeway because he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces on top of having a whole bunch of executive agencies that oversee our policy when it comes to how we orient ourselves throughout the world. And that's why there's layers of separation there between them. They're not all doing the exact same thing. And you can vote separately on them so that they can check one another. Do you want to accumulate this much power into the executive? As a voter, do you not want your representatives up there on the Congressional Hill, on Capitol Hill? Do you not want them to be able to defy and limit the power of the president? That is part of their job. That is not necessarily their main job. Their main job is to represent you and your interests up there. But the question falls down to, once you get past the individual issues you care about, do you want them to be a check for the president, or do you want them to be a lame duck body that basically throws away all the procedures that actually allow them to check the power of the president? What if Donald Trump does something that you really don't like and you voted for a Tim Kaine and you're sitting there saying, okay, hey, he's actually checking the power here, and then something changes and he just steps aside and Tim Kaine says, oh, nope, I'm just going to fall in line with Donald Trump. Different party. I understand the dynamics are a little bit different there, but you would still ask the question, why is Tim Kaine not representing the interests of his people? What if a majority of the people in his district said, actually, no, hey, we don't want this specific policy to go through, and we think that by you stepping down, you're empowering the president to do something that accumulates too much power in the hands of the president, or simply is something that you don't want to have to deal with. Maybe you don't like tariff policy, and that's why you voted split ticket in order to have a Senate that would actually be a little bit more contentious and hard for certain policies to get through. Lots of people vote split ticket in order to make sure the legislature is a very slow moving body. And it's interesting how many people actually enjoy that. And though they don't necessarily like the outcome, they don't like the fact that some things move slower when they really like the policy. But when it's policy they don't like, they do enjoy the fact that things are moving slowly and there's lots of consideration that goes into it. So in the process of appointing executive agency heads, I think personally that you really want to have lots of checks on this. You want to make sure that the average person is going to be able to say from your district, if you're a legislator, that they either agree or they have some say, this is the best way to put it, some say on the actions of the executive. Because just because you elect Donald Trump does not mean that you agree with everything that he's going to do. And that is the beautiful thing about the checks and balances that are placed there by the legislator. They are hem in the worst instincts, and maybe even some of the, not necessarily worst, but most out there instincts of the president. And they can still fight for your interest while fighting against someone you voted for. That is the beauty of a system that is representative in nature, not necessarily fully democratic, but a representative democracy. So I know I went a really nerdy on that, and maybe you were sitting here saying that you didn't provide much clarity. Let's actually run through this article, because I don't agree with a lot of the way they frame things, but I do agree with some of the arguments that they propose. Quote, the demand to weaken checks and balances and take for himself some of the legislative branch's usual powers underscored Mr. Trump's authoritarian impulses. While there is no obvious legal obstacle to Mr. Trump's request, also, hold on, let me pause here. I think that they're being over the top here, and they're calling it authoritarian impulses. I think that while you could frame it that way, I'm going to be honest, I think it's more he doesn't want to get bogged down in the Democrats trying to completely derail his presidency as they did last time. And I think that's a justifiable argument from his point of view. That doesn't mean as voters that we should 100% accept it, simply on the principle of not letting the checks and balances be overridden. And that's the beautiful part of having us be able to vote for people individually so that we can ensure that the worst instincts, the ones that may be for the president's own sake rather than the best interest of the American people, are kept in check. Because Trump doesn't want to have to deal with it. And I don't blame him. If I was in his position, I wouldn't want to have to deal with all the baloney that's going to have to come his way. But when it comes to making sure that the U.S. is really, really well represented, whether it be the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, on the world stage, the UN ambassador, we need to make sure that these people go through a very basic smell test, a very basic sniff test, and say, okay, yep, okay, you're manageable, you can step up to represent the United States. We think that your policy is not out there. You're not going to doom us. You're not going to send us towards economic decay, so on and so forth. So like I said, just because I don't agree with their framing doesn't mean they're not making a good point here. Let's go back to the article. Quote, there is no historical precedent for a deliberate and wholesome abandonment by the Senate of its function to decide whether to confirm or reject the president's choices to bestow with government power. And what it's saying here is there has never been a Senate that has fully stepped aside. Maybe there has been a Senate that isn't around and they had to use recess appointments in order to get what they wanted done, or maybe a president waited for a recess to happen, but there has never been a Senate that has willingly said, oh yes, Mr. President, we will step aside for you. Now, I understand when I made the argument earlier that you don't want the norm to be breached. The beautiful thing about this norm is you're not writing a new rule and codifying anything. You are basically asking the leader of the Senate to allow this to happen. And in the future, people can still say no. But also, people tend to bias towards the norm. And if the norm is broken and there's an example of people regularly or willingly stepping down and saying, hey, we will make sure that we go into a full recess in order to allow you to do this, then that means that it's easier for the next person to do it as well. Then again, that is a blank slippery slope argument that and most people would say you can't just make an argument versus on a slippery slope alone, but you can if you think that it's completely rational to see the continued slippage or usage of whatever power in this specific case, whatever power they would be given now. And we have plenty of examples of executive overreach in the past that have continued to grow, whether it be executive orders, whether it be over basically having regulating agencies, regulatory agencies, creating laws like the EPA, so and even FEMA during the COVID times. So to pretend as though that overreach from the executive will not continue to happen and breaking of the norms is not something that will give a permission structure to the other side to do it or even your own side to do it, that is not a blank slippery slope. That is a justified slippery slope. So I'm not trying to say, oh, it's a slippery slope and that's it. I'm trying to provide a little bit of context here as to why it will make sense. So yes, willingly stepping aside, which is what basically every single person who is vying for leadership in the Senate right now has basically said, okay, Mr. Trump, yeah, we'll actually guarantee that if I'm going to be elected to the majority leader in the Senate, I will actually agree to that. He's basically made that a prerequisite to run for the Senate leadership, and that is outrageous to me. I understand people are willing to give the executive so much more power. We fled from a king for a reason. That is not to pretend that the president is a absolute king. There are still plenty of balances, especially from the judicial branch when it comes to executive orders and the ability to use his quote-unquote mandate in order to get his message across and use regulatory agencies and executive bodies in order to get what he wants. The judiciary still has a really, really strong ability to check that. I mean, Chevron deference or the overturning of certain EPA provisions. Like we've seen plenty of examples of the judicial system coming in and stripping the regulatory state of some of its power. So I'm not trying to pretend that they are without checks and balances, but you have to have checks and balances from all different sides. That's why you remember that you probably thought it was a really stupid graph in U.S. history and U.S. government of the triangle. You have the presidency, you have the judicial branch and the legislature, and they all have checks and balances on one another. Well, if you're going to completely limp the legislator over time and just leave it between the presidency and the judicial branch, and then they're at odds with one another, they're going to start fighting over power. Versus if it's a triumvirate and people have to negotiate between the three, it is harder to actually just pin all of your ire and anger against one or the other and actually strip power from one or the other. So the legislator can actually pass bills if they're still powerful. They can use their ability to make sure that certain people who might actually go after judicial power and try to limit it in the executive agencies, they can be put in check. The executive can actually say, hey, we're not going to implement this law because it doesn't necessarily make sense, and make sure that they don't overstep their bounds on trying to restrict the judiciary, and the judiciary can do both for each. That's why you have to have a threefold system rather than a twofold system where the ire is more easily pointed at one side or another, and there's not a third body protecting the norms. Because guess what? If the legislator's seeing the judiciary overstep its bounds and actually overcheck the president, if they don't like it, guess what? They can step in and try to limit the power of the judiciary by trying to pass different laws and change the current statutes on the books in order to make sure that the judiciary doesn't get too far out of hand. And it goes the way for all the others because they could worry that the judiciary might actually try to limit the power of Congress in the future. So basically, if you have three people all fighting for power and it's relatively well balanced, it's going to be much easier than two people fighting for power and being able to direct all of their ire towards one side and having no outside mechanism to defend themselves besides the powers that are being questioned and argued against by the, in the case of the example I provided earlier, if it's just the judiciary and the executive, then it's a lot easier if you have an outside third party looking in, trying to make sure that neither one gets too much power so that they don't get hamstrung in the future. Sorry, once again, really long rant. And I think that honestly summarizes most of my thoughts on this one. I think it is a bad move. Do I understand why Trump wants to do it? 100%. 100%. But that does not mean that we need to let the norms slip anymore. I understand the norms have already slipped in so many places, but this is a key power. This is the first check on the presidency's agenda when it comes to coming into power. And the president, just because he's elected by the entire nation, does not have an unlimited mandate. Guess what? Those other representatives in the legislature, they were also elected by the people, and they also represent the interests of said people. So you cannot let because like I said, split ticket voting is a thing. It's not an unlimited mandate just passed because, oh yeah, we voted R for the entire thing. There are split ticket voters who have different priorities and therefore giving the legislators different mandates, and you have to make sure that you synthesize those different mandates on the executive and the legislative level in order to get what is best for the American people, what the American people actually want, and to the broader point, do we really want to have a unitary executive? I don't. I really don't. We have already had so much executive expansion over the course of the 20th century and coming into the 21st century. I mean, executive orders alone are taking up so much extra space in our books. Come on, guys. Come on, guys. We've got to check the executive at some point, or at least stop the expansion or stop the willingly handing over power to them. And this is one thing we can do. Don't let this norm slip. Contact your senator. Tell them that you're not okay with it, especially if you are in a red state. Especially contact your senator 100%. All right. So let's go to, we've been in the Senate there for a while. Let's go to the House. What is going on in this neck of the woods? This article comes from the Wall Street Journal. Republican euphoria punctured by tough math in the House. So, for those of you who were alive in early January of this last year, and also in November of the year before, you may remember the absolute cluster that was McCarthy coming to power, putting in a clause where basically one person can call for him to be ousted or have a vote of no confidence, and then having Mr. Mike Johnson come on up and not actually remove that clause. So that's still looming over the head of the legislator, and even if the Republicans get a majority in the House, that is still looming over them, but there's even more to it. Quote, party leaders still bruised from infighting over the past 2 years that led to the ouster of the GOP speaker and embarrassing failed votes say things will be different this time. The squabbles were exacerbated by the party's historically small majority this Congress, now at 221 to 213 with one vacancy, and leaders are now bracing for a similarly narrow advantage next year. So you may be saying, whoa, wait, hold on. I thought they were winning the House. No. You're 100% right. They are winning the House. But that doesn't mean that the majority is an absolute blowout. Once again, it's going to be close like the Senate, and all it takes is a few people peeling off. Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene comes in again and says, nope, hey, Mike Johnson, I do not like your agenda. I do not like what you're doing here. This is not okay, my man. I do not believe that you are looking out for the best interests of the people of America, but even more specifically, the people that I represent in Georgia. So when you have these many different competing interests at heart, and you have what seems to be a mandate to fulfill your agenda, there are going to be people within the party that, one, when the slim majority is there, and okay, so I'll outline the two things again, just because I feel like I didn't make them clear. You have a slim majority there, and you also have a mandate from the people that put you into power. You're going to use that if you're a smart politician who, maybe you fear getting ostracized, which is fair enough. But if you're a smart politician, you're going to use that in order to actually get what you want. Maybe you want a little bit of extra spending on military bases. Maybe you want a little bit less spending on EPA I say you want a little bit less oversight on some of the new building projects that are coming into your area, and you want some adjustment on EPA rules, or you want limitations put on the EPA from the congressional level. You're going to use that narrow majority to actually get a little bit of leverage and get what you want out of the term. This is more than likely going to happen, and because they did not have an absolute blowout this time, yes, the Republicans have a slight majority, but they did not have an absolute blowout, and we have seen their tendencies towards self-destruction in the past. It has been less than a year. At this point, it has been a little bit over a year, because it was happening towards the late part of October. It has been basically a year and a month since we saw the McCarthy incident go absolutely crazy, and it's been less than a year since we saw the hassle between Mike Johnson. It has been, like I said before, it was an absolute cluster. So to pretend as though when most of those same people are still in the office, they're still there on Capitol Hill, to pretend as though this is not a possibility to go absolutely crazy is, I don't want to say idiotic, but it is naive to say the least. Well, guess what? There's also another person that this article spells out specifically, which I thought honestly was absolutely hilarious that they're calling her out like this. But hey, I'll just read this section because she could be a person who is going to be an issue for the Republican agenda moving forward. Quote, already some Republican members who returned to Washington this week indicated that they won't be bossed around in the next term. Rep. Victoria Spars said she isn't worried about repercussions from Trump if she decides to break from the Republican leader's orders on long-term government spending or health care policy. She's a Republican from Indiana. Quote, I've always been an independent thinker and have been willing to challenge my own party, she said. Asked what kind of consequences a Republican could face for stepping out of line, one lawmaker replied, ask Bob Good. And Bob Good was someone who basically got shot out of he got basically out primaried because he had backed Ron DeSantis, and then Trump put somebody in. It's like, no, I'm going to back this person. That's not okay. That is unloyal. So why I'm trying to bring up both of these things is shows the tension between the options. Either you stand up for what you believe in and you possibly gain that leverage, or you stand up for your people and you can get admired by them, or you can also face down the Trump political machine, the endorsement machine, and see how you fare. And I think it is going to be so much more, I don't want to say annoying. I feel like right now Republicans are running high because they feel as though they have, like I said before, they feel as though they have the mandate. And to some degree, they have a mandate. Then again, I think most winning parties and coalitions always overestimate what their mandate is, but fair enough, they have some form of mandate. But as we get closer to the actual operating and we get closer to actually parsing the language of bills and different policies, it is going to get extremely, extremely tight, as it always does, especially when you have those so-called independent thinkers who aren't just looking out for the MAGA movement, but are actually care about the people in their districts who may not be straight R's. They may be conflicted R's. They may be mixed R's. They may be working class R's. It doesn't matter. They could be working class Democrats that voted R this time. There are different constituencies across the nation that will call for different responses to any legislation coming forward. And though they're feeling high right now because of the mandate, reality is going to smack them in the face here really soon. And I think it's going to be, I don't want to say hilarious because I don't love having dysfunction displayed to the world from our internal politics, like having the House be absolutely crazy and not being able to get funding passed when it looks bad when we're trying to say, hey, we're going to support XYZ country and we can't even get certain legislation passed. That doesn't mean that I agree that we should send that money over to other countries, but at least on an optics level, it does not look good when we are afraid like that. But I think that the chaos will provide a little bit of levity in comparison to the terrible things that it will bring. And, hey, can't necessarily say that it's a great thing, can't say it's a bad thing. It's just the reality of the situation. All right, so let's jump to our final article that talks about what Trump could do with colleges. And the headline reads, with a Trump administration on the horizon, America's universities face an uncomfortable reckoning. And this is coming from the New York Sun, by the way. Now, I'll be honest, there's only really one section that I want to read about actual restrictions that Trump, or restrictions that the government could put in place that could actually affect some of these places. Otherwise, if you want to read the rest of the speculation coming out from this article, you can go find the links in the description below, that like and subscribe button. I will have them posted there. You can go read it yourself. But this is the really key part of what the government can actually do. Quote, the most likely government action, the group says, would be for the government to pump the brakes on issuing new research grants to universities, a move that would require no justification at all. So think about your Stanfords, your MITs, your Harvards, your big science schools, your UT Austins. If they have their grants stripped away from them, they will not be able to do as much research. And a lot of their research, whether it be faculty and students or just student research, a lot of that, if it's done underneath the university head, can actually net them money in patents in later on. And also the government can also get money from patents later on. So you actually could be kneecapping yourself a bit there, but if you want to hurt the university, that is one way to do it. Quote, the government could also squeeze the enrollment of international students, a majority of whom pay full tuition without aid, by curbing issuances of student visas. Columbia boasts upwards of 13,800 international students. Losing out on the cohort could cost them up to $8 million. $8 million in tuition. $800 million. Sorry, I said $8 million. That's still a lot of money. $800 million in tuition. Imagine the bite out of their endowment that they're going to have to take when they don't necessarily have the people that are paying full price in order to go to their university from outside the nation. Because that's how they're able to subsidize. I mean, like, people that come from out of state and from overseas are able to normally subsidize the different programs, grants, and easements, so to speak, that they can give to students that are from in-state or who have really good grades. So, I mean, let's be clear. There are other grants. There are scholarships that are funded privately. There are separate endowment funds that are made just for certain scholarships. I understand. But the people that pay full price offset a lot of the other costs that Columbia may be eating in other cases. And that is not something that they want to deal with. So there could be a lot of pain coming down the pike. And that is not something that Columbia is looking forward to, or Harvard, or the MITs, or any of these universities, whether it be Chapel Hill, UT Austin. I don't think UT University of Tennessee Knoxville has any problems, but maybe it does. You're definitely looking at your Colorado State, probably not going to have a fun time. Stanford's. I mean, there could be a big reckoning coming down, especially with the ones that allowed these different protests, which Republicans saw as a huge, huge problem on college campuses. And if the government is really jonesing to get revenge for this, it could be very, very bad for them. But with that said, let's jump to our final article. It's supposed to leave you with a smile. It is indeed our daily delight. And this one comes from Animals Around the Globe. Meet the man who has been friends with a target shark for 22 years. And let's be clear, this is a guy who is constantly diving with them. He's trying to tell people that it's actually not as scary as some people believe. I don't know if I believe him. I'm going to be 100% real with you. I don't know about that one, Chief. Do not catch me in that tank. You're not going to catch me in that tank or even in the sea with those tiger sharks. Not happening, my dude. But he claims that it's true. If you want to read that entire story, you want to see how he interacts with him, and they kind of nuzzle up against him and rub, and kind of like a cat trying to, just run its body across your leg kind of thing. It is kind of adorable. But if you want to learn more, you can, like I said earlier, go to the links in the description below, the like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you stick around here on Tuesday and Thursday, you'll see 6 and 6, which is 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. That is all on the YouTube channel and the RSS feed. It's international news. So that's a segment that we've been developing here, and it's a fun one to make. I actually very much enjoy it, and I enjoy zooming out from America and discussing those sort of things and bringing you that information in a really concise way. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.